The silver blade in Alara's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the rhythmic primal pulsing of the ground beneath her boots. Above, the sky wasn't dark. It was hemorrhaging. The moon hung like a bruised, heavy fruit, swollen and weeping a deep, visceral crimson that stained the mist of the Blackwood forest. This was the night of the blood moon, a celestial anomaly that the elders whispered turned the blood of the living into liquid fire. Alara Huntley had spent 24 years running from the shadows of her lineage, but tonight the shadows had grown teeth. "He's coming for you, Alara," a voice hissed through the pines though no one was there. "And you'll find that the hunger in his eyes is the only thing more dangerous than the secrets in your own." Hello to every single one of you joining us today from around the globe. Whether you're watching from a rainy balcony in London, a quiet room in Tokyo, or right here in the heart of the States, I am so incredibly grateful to have you here. How are you all doing today? I hope you're ready for a journey that will test the very limits of the heart. Before we dive deeper into the crimson mist of this legend, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel, and I don't want you to miss a single second of the mystery we're about to uncover. Are you subscribed? Good. Then let's step into the woods. The air grew thick, smelling of ozone and crushed jasmine. Every breath Alara took felt like swallowing velvet. She shouldn't have been here. She was a woman of logic, a restorer of ancient artifacts who dealt in cold stone and dusty parchment, not celestial omens. But the locket around her neck, a relic left by a mother she never knew, was vibrating with a terrifying heat, acting as a compass pointing toward the center of the grove. Then the silence of the forest didn't just break, it shattered. A figure emerged from the veil of red mist. He didn't walk, he moved like a predator reclaiming a throne. He was tall, his silhouette sharp enough to cut the fog, dressed in charcoal layers that seemed to absorb the moonlight. This was Julian Corleone. His eyes, usually described in whispers as the color of a winter sea, were currently reflecting the lunar gore, glowing with an amber intensity that froze the air in Alara's lungs. "You're late, Alara," Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly cello note that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. He was barely 5 feet away now. The tension between them was a physical thing, a high-voltage wire stretched to the snapping point. Alara raised the dagger, her knuckles white. "Who are you? And why does my blood feel like it's trying to jump out of my veins the moment you look at me?" Julian took a step closer, ignoring the weapon. The heat radiating from him was a physical force, a seductive gravity that mocked her resolve. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering just inches from her throat, and for a heartbeat, the entire forest went deafeningly silent. "I am the man who has waited 300 years for this moon to bleed," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips with a hunger that wasn't just physical, it was ancestral. "And you? You are the key that is going to either break my curse or bury us both under this crimson sky. The question is, Alara, do you want to know why you've been dreaming of my face long before we ever met?" As the moon reached its zenith, the locket around Alara's neck snapped open, revealing not a photo but a glowing map etched in bone. The ground began to groan, and Alara realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the seduction wasn't just happening between her and this dangerous stranger. The very earth was trying to pull them together into a descent there might be no returning from. What was hidden in Alara's blood that the moon was so desperate to wake up? And why did Julian Corleone look at her like she was both his salvation and his greatest sin? The map etched in bone within the locket didn't just glow. It hummed, a low-frequency vibration that resonated in Alara's molars. She stepped back, her boots crunching on the frost-nipped leaves that were now stained a deep, bruised purple under the lunar glare. Julian Corleone didn't follow, but his presence remained an anchored weight in the clearing, pulling at her like a tide. Alara was a woman who built her life on the tangible. As a high-end archivist for the Sterling Museum, her world was defined by the scent of old parchment, the cool weight of marble and the logical progression of history. She was the person people called when they needed to know the exact provenance of a 14th-century signet ring or the hidden meaning behind a Renaissance fresco. She lived in a minimalist loft in the city, surrounded by white walls and organized shelves, a stark contrast to the chaotic, bleeding wilderness she now stood in. Her deepest fear had always been the unexplainable, the messy variables of emotion and fate that couldn't be filed away in a drawer. Yet here she was, her pulse behaving like a trapped bird, reacting to a man who looked like he'd stepped out of the very myths she spent her days debunking. You're trembling, Alara Sterling, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, smoothing out the jagged edges of the night. He used her professional surname, a detail she hadn't given him. Is it the cold, or are you finally starting to remember? I don't remember anything about you, she snapped, though it was a lie. For months, her sleep had been a battlefield of vivid sensory dreams. The scent of cedar and rain, the feeling of a heavy cloak against her skin, and those same amber eyes watching her from across a ballroom that smelled of wax and ancient secrets. Julian stepped into a shaft of blood-red light. Up close, the predatory grace was even more pronounced. He was the CEO of Corleone Antiquities, a man known in the corporate world for his ruthless acquisitions and a private life that was a complete vacuum of information. To the public he was a billionaire recluse. To Alara in this moment he was a living enigma. He wore a tailored coat that clung to broad shoulders, but there was a ruggedness to him, faint scars across his knuckles that suggested he was more familiar with blades than boardrooms. His motivation wasn't money. It was a desperate, centuries-old search for a specific frequency of soul. You think you're here by accident? That the Sterling Museum just happened to receive that locket anonymously on the eve of the blood moon. Julian's smile was thin, devoid of warmth but overflowing with a dark, magnetic intelligence. Your father, Silas Sterling, spent his entire life trying to shield you from this. He died keeping the secret of the blood moon because he knew that once the cycle restarted, you wouldn't be able to resist the pull. Alara felt a sharp pang of grief. Her father, a quiet man who tinkered with watches, had died 3 years ago, leaving her with more questions than memories. He had always been overprotective, insisting she never wear jewelry or travel during the lunar eclipses. She had dismissed it as the eccentricities of a lonely man. Now, seeing the way Julian looked at the locket, she realized her father hadn't been eccentric. He had been a sentry. Behind Julian, 2 figures emerged from the tree line. His inner circle. There was Elena Ripley, a woman with sharp features and eyes that seemed to track the movement of the wind, Julian's most trusted advisor and a master of linguistics. Beside her stood Dominic Toretto, a man built like a fortress, whose silence was more intimidating than a shout. They weren't just employees. They were a pack, bound to Julian by a loyalty that felt older than their years. The ritual site is active, Julian, Elena said, her voice tight with an urgency that made the hair on Alara's neck stand up. The veil is thinning. If we don't move now, the window closes for another century. Alara looked from the bone map to Julian. She felt an inexplicable urge to trust him, a magnetic north pulling her toward his shadow. It was terrifying. She was a woman of facts, and the fact was that this man was dangerous. But there was another fact, one she couldn't ignore. When he looked at her, the emptiness she'd felt since her father's death seemed to vanish, replaced by a terrifying electric sense of belonging. Why me? Alara whispered, the dagger lowering just an inch. What am I to you? Julian moved then, a blur of motion that ended with him standing directly in her space. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of his body, the scent of sandalwood and old wood smoke. To the world you are an archivist. To the moon you are the blood bride. And to me, he leaned down, his breath ghosting over her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. To me, you are the only person who can keep me from becoming the monster everyone thinks I am. The locket flared with a sudden, blinding white light, momentarily drowning out the red. A low howl echoed through the forest. Not a wolf, but something larger, hungrier. The ground began to vibrate violently, and the bone map shifted, the lines of ink turning into liquid gold that began to flow toward the center of the grove. We're out of time, Julian said, extending a hand. His palm was calloused, steady and waiting. The forest is waking up, Alara. You can stay here and let the shadows take you, or you can come with me and find out why your blood is singing. Alara looked at his hand, then up at the weeping moon. The mystery was a lure, and she was already hooked. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, and the moment their skin met, a shock of pure, unadulterated energy slammed through her, a revelation of fire and ice that demanded she follow him into the dark. The moment Alara's fingers brushed Julian's, the world didn't just tilt, it dissolved. A searing jolt of electricity, part ice, part wildfire, raced up her arm, blooming in her chest like a physical weight. The bone map in the locket shrieked, a high-pitched metallic whine that drowned out the rustle of the trees. Julian's grip tightened, his hand swallowing hers, grounding her even as the reality around them began to fracture. "Don't let go," Julian growled, his voice no longer just a sound, but a vibration felt in her very marrow. Suddenly the ground beneath the center of the grove didn't just shake. It surrendered. A massive circular slab of stone, hidden for centuries under layers of peat and ancient roots, groaned and began to spiral downward into the earth. It was a mechanical maw opening in the forest floor, a descent into a subterranean throat that smelled of damp earth and something metallic, something like old coins and dried blood. "Julian, the perimeter is breached." Dominic Toretto's voice boomed. He had already drawn a pair of heavy, blackened pistols, his eyes fixed on the tree line where the shadows were no longer behaving like shadows. They were coalescing, thickening into oily, lupin shapes that moved with a sickening liquid speed. These weren't animals. They were the shadow-bound, the remnants of those who had failed the Blood Moon's trial in centuries past. "Elena, get the seals ready," Julian commanded, his focus never leaving Alara. He practically lifted her off her feet, pulling her onto the descending stone platform just as the first shadow beast lunged. The creature was a nightmare of smoke and teeth, its eyes two glowing embers of spite. Dominic's shots rang out, thunderous cracks that echoed through the trees, but the bullets passed through the smoke with only a hiss of dissipation. "They can't be killed by lead tonight, Alara," Julian whispered, his breath hot against her temple as they sank into the darkness of the earth. "Only by the light you're carrying." "I'm not carrying any light," Alara cried, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic drum. "The locket," Julian shouted over the grinding of the stone gears. "Alara, look at it." She looked down. The bone map wasn't just glowing anymore. It was radiating a blinding, pulse-like rhythm of gold that seemed to act as a physical barrier. As the stone platform descended further into a vast, cavernous hall beneath the forest, the light from the locket struck the shadow beasts that tried to follow, dissolving them into nothingness with a sound like steam hitting ice. They reached the bottom with a jarring thud. They were in a cathedral of roots and obsidian. Massive pillars of black stone rose to support a ceiling lost in gloom, and in the center of the hall stood an altar carved from a single translucent piece of crimson crystal, the heart of the blood moon. But they weren't alone. Standing by the altar was a man Alara recognized from the headlines of the art world, Brooks Wickham, a rival collector known for his slash-and-burn style of acquisition. But he didn't look like a businessman now. He wore robes of deep violet, and his eyes were wide with a feverish, fanatic glow. "Julian," Brooks sneered, his voice echoing off the obsidian walls. "You brought the key. How kind of you to do the heavy lifting." "Brooks," Julian's voice was a low, lethal warning. He stepped in front of Alara, shielding her with his body. "You're playing with forces that will erase you before you can even scream." "I'm playing with the power of gods," Brooks retorted. He held up a hand and the crimson crystal altar began to hum in synchronicity with Alara's locket. "The blood moon doesn't just grant immortality, Julian. It grants the power to rewrite the past. And I have so much I want to change." This was the inciting incident that shattered Alara's world. She wasn't just an observer, she was the catalyst. Brooks raised a curved sacrificial blade, but he didn't point it at Julian. He pointed it at the altar. "If the blood bride won't give her heart willingly, the moon will take it by force." Before Alara could process the threat, the locket around her neck suddenly constricted, pulling her toward the altar like a tether. She was dragged forward, her boots skidding on the slick obsidian. Julian lunged to catch her, but a wall of crimson energy slammed into him, throwing him backward against a pillar. "Alara!" Julian's roar was full of a raw, desperate agony she hadn't expected from him. As she reached the altar, the locket snapped into a circular indentation in the crystal. A beam of pure red light shot upward, piercing through the ceiling, through the earth, and straight into the weeping moon above. The connection was made. The mystery was no longer a story. It was a trap. Alara looked back at Julian, who was struggling to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his brow. In that moment of absolute terror, she didn't see the dangerous billionaire or the enigmatic predator. She saw a man who looked terrified of losing her, not because she was a key, but because of something much deeper. Leave a comment below if you've ever felt like your destiny was being pulled by strings you couldn't see. The narrator's voice might interject here, but the tension on screen is too thick to break. Are you Team Julian, or do you think Alara should run for her life? Subscribe now to see if they survive the next 10 minutes. The cavern began to fill with a rhythmic, wet thumping, the heartbeat of the moon itself. The walls began to bleed. The trial had begun, and there was no way out but through the fire. The air in the obsidian cathedral didn't just grow cold. It became predatory. As the crimson beam connected the altar to the weeping moon above, the very physics of the room began to warp. Shadows stretched toward Alara like eager fingers, and the rhythmic thumping of the moon's heart felt like it was trying to sync with her own pulse, threatening to override her biological rhythm with something ancient and cold. Get away from her, Brooks. Julian's voice was a tectonic shift of rage. He didn't just stand up, he exploded toward the altar. But the violet-robed collector, Brooks Wickham, only laughed, a jagged, brittle sound that echoed off the black glass walls. With a flick of his wrist, Brooks summoned a barrier of swirling gray mist, a wall of pure entropy that forced Julian to skid to a halt, the soles of his boots smoking against the stone. You're too late, Julian, Brooks sneered, his fingers hovering inches from Alara's throat. The Blood Bride has accepted the invitation. The contract is written in the stars, and your family's debt is finally being called in. Alara's breath hitched. Family debt. She looked at Julian, her eyes searching his for a denial, but all she saw was a flicker of ancient, agonizing guilt. Julian, what is he talking about? She gasped, her hands gripping the edges of the translucent altar. The crystal was no longer cold. It was searing, the heat traveling up her arms, branding her with a phantom sensation of history she didn't own. Don't listen to him, Alara. Julian shouted, his muscles straining against the invisible pressure of the mist. He's using the blood moon's influence to poison your mind. Look at me. Just look at me. She did. And in the chaos, amidst the swirling shadows and the screaming light, their eyes locked. It was a moment of profound, quiet intimacy in the center of a hurricane. For a heartbeat, the cavern vanished. She saw Julian not as a billionaire or a predator, but as a man who had spent a lifetime in a self-imposed prison of duty, waiting for a girl he had only seen in the fractured glass of a prophecy. The attraction between them wasn't just a spark. It was a conflagration, a biological necessity that made her skin hum with a desperate need to be closer to him, even as the danger escalated. Dominic, Blana, break the perimeter. Julian roared, realizing he couldn't reach her alone. Dominic Toretto didn't hesitate. He slammed a fresh magazine into his blackened pistol, this one etched with silver runes that caught the red moonlight. He began a methodical, rhythmic advancement, each shot he fired carving a path through the shadow beasts that were pouring from the walls. Elena Ripley was a blur of motion beside him, her hands weaving through the air as she shouted incantations in a tongue that sounded like grinding stones and rushing water. She was dismantling the mist barrier, her face pale with the effort. Keep your eyes on me, Alara. Julian commanded, taking a brutal step forward as the mist began to thin. The locket, it's not just a key, it's a filter. Use your intent. Don't let the moon take your identity. But the blood moon was a master of misdirection. As the tension rose, the cavern walls began to display flickering images, hallucinations fueled by the lunar gore. Alara saw her father, Silas, but he wasn't the kind watchmaker she remembered. He was standing in this very room centuries ago, dressed in the same charcoal layers Julian wore now. He was shaking hands with a man who looked exactly like Julian, an ancestor. The Sterlings weren't victims, the moon whispered into her mind. They were the jailers. Is it true? Alara cried, her voice breaking. Did my family start this? Did we trap you in this cycle? Julian flinched, a moment of vulnerability that almost cost him his life as a shadow beast clawed at his shoulder, shredding the expensive fabric of his coat. It's more complicated than that, Alara. We were both trapped. My family sought the power and yours sought to contain it. We are two sides of the same cursed coin. The revelation was a physical blow. Everything Alara believed about her boring, safe life was a lie. Her father hadn't been protecting her from a monster. He had been hiding her from a destiny she was born to fulfill. Brooks Wickham seized the moment of her distraction. He grabbed the locket, trying to twist it out of the altar's socket. If you won't use the power to rewrite the world, I will. I'll start by erasing the Corleone bloodline from history. No. Alara screamed. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed Brooks's wrist. The contact was a mistake. A surge of feedback, a mixture of Brooks's greed and the moon's malice, slammed into Alara. The cavern groaned. Huge shards of obsidian began to fall from the ceiling like black rain. One massive pillar toppled, separating Julian from Alara by a mountain of rubble. "Julian," she shrieked, her voice lost in the thunder of collapsing stone. "Alara, stay where you are." His muffled voice came from the other side. "I'm coming for you. Don't let him touch the crystal." The tension was at a breaking point. Alara was alone with a madman, her protector was buried behind a wall of glass, and the moon above was turning a shade of red that suggested the seduction was about to turn into a slaughter. The dust from the collapsed obsidian pillar hung in the air like grounded stars, shimmering with a sickly violet light. On one side of the rubble, Alara could hear Julian's muffled rhythmic strikes against the stone, a desperate metallic clanging as he tried to claw his way through the mountain of glass separating them. On her side, the air felt thin, vacuum-sealed by the sheer malice radiating from Brooks Wickham. "You don't understand the geography of your own soul, Alara," Brooks hissed, his fingers tightening around the locket still embedded in the altar. "You think Julian is your protector? Your savior?" He laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "He didn't find you because of a connection. He found you because he's a bloodhound, and you are the only harvest that can stop him from turning into dust." Alara's heart skipped a beat, a cold stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. "What are you talking about? The Corleone line didn't just seek power," Brooks sneered, stepping closer, the red light of the moon casting long demonic shadows across his face. "They stole it. Centuries ago they siphoned the vitality of the blood moon to stay eternal, but the moon is a jealous creditor. Every few generations it demands its interest back. Julian isn't 300 years old because of a healthy diet, darling. He's alive because your ancestors, the Sterlings, struck a bargain to keep him tethered to this realm using their life force as an anchor." The world seemed to tilt. Alara looked at the rubble at the spot where Julian was screaming her name, his voice raw with a terror she had mistaken for love. "He doesn't love you, Alara," Brooks whispered, leaning in so close she could smell the metallic tang of his greed. "He needs you. You aren't his soulmate, you're his battery. The moment you activate that altar fully, your vitality will flow into him, renewing his lease on life for another century well, look at what happened to your father. Silas didn't die of old age. He gave the last of his spark to keep the Corleone Empire standing." "No," Alara whispered, the word catching in her throat. "That's a lie. My father, he loved me." "He loved you enough to hide you," Brooks countered, "but he was bound by the same blood oath you are. Look at the bone map, Alara. Read the script." Driven by a masochistic need to know, Alara looked down at the locket. Under the intense crimson glare, the liquid gold ink shifted. It wasn't a map of the forest. It was a ledger. Names were etched in the bone, hundreds of them, and at the very bottom beneath Silas Sterling was her own name, glowing with a faint, expectant light. Beside it, linked by a permanent jagged line, was Julian Corleone. The revelation shattered her. The electric attraction she felt, the magnetic pull, the sense of belonging, it wasn't destiny. It was a biological leash. Every touch that had made her feel alive was actually a siphon, a predestined drainage of her very essence. Suddenly the wall of rubble exploded. Julian burst through the dust, his clothes shredded, his hands bleeding from tearing at the obsidian. He looked like a fallen angel, beautiful and terrifying in his rage. He didn't look at Brooks. He looked straight at Alara, his amber eyes wide with a desperate, haunting vulnerability. "Alara, step away from him," Julian commanded, his voice trembling. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice steady even as her world crumbled. She didn't move toward him. She stayed by the altar, her hand hovering over the crystal. "Am I just an anchor for you? Was my father just a sacrifice to keep you young?" Julian froze. The silence that followed was louder than the thumping of the moon. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. The guilt on his face was a map of 3 centuries of regret. "It started that way," Julian whispered, taking a slow, tentative step forward. "For 200 years I looked for the Sterling heir because I wanted to survive. I won't lie to you about that. But then I saw you, Alara. Not in a prophecy but in that museum 3 months ago. I saw the way you touched the past with such reverence, the way you smiled at things that were broken. And for the first time in 3 centuries I didn't want to survive. I wanted to live. With my life. Alara's eyes filled with tears. No. Julian roared. That's why I haven't finished the ritual. I've been trying to find a way to break the bond without hurting you. That's why I brought you here. Not to drain you but to use the blood moon's peak to sever the tie forever. He's lying. Brooks screamed, lunging for the locket. The stakes had reached their highest point. If Alara turned the locket to the left, she would fulfill the ancient bargain, giving Julian another century of life but losing herself in the process. If she turned it to the right, she might break the curse, or she might destroy them both. Before she could choose, the blood moon reached its absolute zenith. The crimson beam widened, engulfing the entire altar in a pillar of fire. The passion and mystery that had intertwined since the first moment they met now collided in a moment of pure, blinding revelation. Believe me, Alara. Julian cried out over the roar of the celestial energy, reaching out his hand. I would rather turn to ash than take another second of your life. The choice was hers. But as the floor began to liquefy under the heat of the moon's gaze, Alara realized that the truth was even more dangerous than the lie. The pillar of crimson fire didn't just illuminate the cavern. It began to consume it. The temperature plummeted to a bone-chilling sub-zero, the paradoxical heat of the blood moon stealing the warmth from Alara's skin. The translucent altar beneath her hands began to hairline fracture, each crack sounding like a gunshot echoing through the obsidian halls. Alara, look at me. Julian's voice was a ragged plea, barely audible over the cosmic roar. But she couldn't. The weight of the revelation, the centuries of Sterling's sacrifice to keep the Corleone heart beating, felt like an anchor dragging her into an abyss of betrayal. Every tender look Julian had given her, every electric brush of his hand, now felt like the calculated move of a predator tenderizing its prey. You're a parasite, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Julian flinched as if she'd struck him with a physical blade. He reached out, his fingers trembling, but before he could close the distance, Brooks Wickham let out a guttural, triumphant scream. Brooks hadn't been waiting for an explanation. He'd been waiting for the exact moment of Alara's emotional collapse. The bond is brittle. Brooks shrieked, his eyes now entirely violet, reflecting the necrotic energy of the moon. The blood bride doubts. The anchor is slipping. With a surge of borrowed strength, Brooks slammed a heavy, obsidian-encrusted staff into the base of the altar. The ground groaned in agony. A chasm of pure shadow ripped open between Alara and Julian, a jagged tear in reality that smelled of ancient dust and forgotten graves. No. Julian lunged, his fingers grazing Alara's coat as the floor beneath her feet tilted toward the void. But the moon wasn't finished with its cruelty. As Alara slid toward the edge, the locket around her neck, the bone map that held her father's legacy, suddenly turned ice cold. A phantom image of Silas Sterling appeared in the mist, his face etched with a sorrow so profound it broke what was left of Alara's heart. Run, Alara, the specter whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. Don't let the cycle claim you. Let him fade. Let it all end. The separation was total. On one side of the widening abyss, Julian stood paralyzed by the sight of the man he had helped drain of life. On the other, Alara hung over the edge of the chasm, her fingers white-knuckled as she clung to the cracked rim of the altar. Dominic. Elena. Julian roared, but his team was fighting their own losing battle. The shadow beasts had evolved. They were no longer smoke. They were solid, hulking masses of obsidian and hate. Dominic was down on one knee, his silver-etched pistols empty, his face masked in blood. Elena was slumped against a pillar, her hands glowing with a faint, dying ember of magic as she tried to hold back a wave of darkness that looked like a living sea. The situation was hopeless. Choose Alara. Brooks laughed, standing over her like a vulture. Give me the locket and save yourself, or hold on to it and fall into the void with the rest of the Sterling ghosts. Julian can't save you, he can't even save himself. Alara looked at Julian. For the first time the predatory grace was gone. He looked old. Not in years but in spirit. The amber glow in his eyes was flickering, dying out as the connection to her vitality was severed by the chasm. His skin was turning the color of parchment. Without her he was finally becoming the 300-year-old corpse he was meant to be. Do it, Julian whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He sank to his knees on the opposite side of the rift. Let me go, Alara. Your father was right. I am a monster for ever letting you find out. Save yourself. Take the locket and run. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Alara had ever felt. She was alone in the dark, her protector was dying, her enemy was triumphant. And the man she thought she loved was revealed to be her family's greatest tragedy. This is the moment where every viewer's heart stops. If you're screaming at the screen right now, you aren't alone. Is Julian truly a villain, or is he a victim of the same curse? Tell me in the comments. Would you save him or let him fall? And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button because the turning point is about to change everything you think you know about the blood moon. Alara's grip slipped. One finger. She looked into the bottomless dark of the chasm, where the ghosts of 100 sterlings seemed to wait for her. I can't, she sobbed, her tears hitting the glowing bone map. The moon reached the absolute nadir of the night. The light turned a bruised, dying purple. This was it. The end of the line. The darkest hour where love was a lie and survival was a sin. The darkness didn't just surround Alara. It began to pull at her soul, a cold vacuum that tasted of salt and ancient grief. Her last finger slipped from the jagged obsidian edge of the altar. She was falling, the wind whistling past her ears like the screams of 1,000 forgotten ancestors. On the other side of the chasm, Julian let out a sound that wasn't human. A raw, agonizing howl of a man watching his only reason for existence vanish into the throat of the earth. But as Alara tumbled into the void, her hand brushed the locket. The tears she had shed, tears of genuine, unselfish grief for her father and for the man she had wanted Julian to be, hit the bone map. The liquid gold ink didn't just glow. It ignited. The locket didn't need her vitality to act as a battery. It needed her humanity to act as a bridge. The ancient bargain hadn't been a cage built by the sterlings. It had been a seal. And only a sterling who could love the monster, despite the debt, could break it. Suddenly the fall stopped. Alara wasn't hitting the bottom. She was levitating in a column of pure, blinding white light that erupted from the locket. The ledger of names in the bone map began to spin, the ink lifting off the bone and weaving into a shimmering tether of gold that shot across the abyss. Julian! Alara screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the moon. Julian, his skin already gray and cracking like old parchment, looked up. The amber in his eyes flared with a sudden, desperate hope. He reached out, his hand trembling, and as the golden tether lashed around his wrist, the gray began to recede. The life flowing into him now wasn't being stolen. It was being shared. It's not a debt, Julian. Alara cried, her body bathed in the white radiance. It's a choice. I choose you. The realization slammed into Julian like a physical force. He didn't just stand, he surged. The golden tether pulled them together, the chasm beneath them beginning to knit itself shut as the light of the sterling line healed the rift the blood moon had exploited. Elena. Now. Julian roared, his voice regaining its cello-like resonance. Elena Ripley, seeing the shift in the tide, slammed her palms against the floor. The dying embers of her magic caught the overflow of Alara's light, turning into a shockwave of silver that shattered the shadow beasts into harmless soot. Dominic Toretto rose from the rubble, his eyes narrowed, and began to advance on Brooks Wickham with a cold, relentless fury. Brooks backed away, his violet eyes wide with terror. No. This is impossible. The moon demands a sacrifice. The cycle cannot be broken. The cycle was built on fear, Brooks, Julian said, his feet hitting the solid ground beside Alara as the chasm vanished. He didn't look at the villain, he looked only at her. He reached out and cupped her face, his touch no longer a siphon but a sanctuary. But the blood moon has no power over a heart that refuses to be owned. The air in the cavern began to change. The oppressive metallic scent of the blood moon was being replaced by the smell of rain and cedar, the scent of Alara's dreams. The red beam from the moon above began to pale, turning from a violent crimson to a soft dawn-like pink. You came back for me, Julian whispered, his forehead resting against hers. I came back for us, Alara replied, her hand over his. The turning point was complete. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were a united front. The mystery of the locket was solved, the betrayal was forgiven, and the courage to love in the face of a centuries-old curse had provided the key to the final confrontation. If you're cheering right now, let me see some hearts in the comments. We are heading into the final showdown. Can Julian and Alara truly end this once and for all? Don't go anywhere, the climax is next. The soft pink glow was a fleeting mercy. Brooks Wickham, backed against the crystalline altar, let out a shriek that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. His human features began to slough away, replaced by a terrifying, translucent carapace of violet energy. He wasn't just a collector anymore. He had allowed himself to be hollowed out, becoming a vessel for the moon's dying spite. If I cannot rewrite history, I will erase the present. Brooks roared. He slammed his fist into the heart of the crimson crystal. The altar didn't just crack, it detonated. Shards of red glass, each one humming with the power of 1,000 cursed knights, flew through the air like lethal shrapnel. Get down! Julian yelled, throwing his body over Alara's. The impact of the explosion sent a shockwave through the cavern that brought the remaining obsidian pillars crashing down. Dominic Toretto moved with the speed of a thunderbolt, intercepting a massive shard headed for Elena, his shoulder taking the hit as he shoved her into the safety of a stone alcove. Julian, the core. It's exposed. Elena screamed, her voice strained as she wove a shimmering shield of blue light around them to deflect the glass rain. In the center of the wreckage, where the altar had stood, a pulsing raw orb of pure lunar fire hovered. It was the source, the concentrated essence of the blood moon's greed. Brooks lunged for it, his hands turning into blackened claws. If he touched that core, he would become a god of shadows, and the world above would never see a sun again. Alara, the locket. Julian said, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. It's the only thing that can contain that much energy. But you have to be the one to do it. My blood is still tainted by the old debt. Yours is the only one that's clean. What do I do? Alara asked, the heat from the core already blistering the air. You have to touch the core with the bone map, Julian explained, his grip on her shoulders steadying her racing heart. But it will try to show you every fear, every doubt, every reason to hate me. You have to stay in the light. You have to stay with me. Always, she whispered. Alara stepped out from behind the shield. The wind inside the cavern was a hurricane now, smelling of ancient copper and ozone. Brooks noticed her and let out a distorted laugh. A mortal girl against the weight of the stars? You'll burn before you get within 10 feet. He sent a wave of violet fire toward her. Julian didn't hesitate. He stepped into the path of the flames, his charcoal coat disintegrating as he used his own body as a shield. He groaned in agony, his skin searing, but he didn't move an inch. Go, Alara. Now, he gasped. Driven by a love that had transcended a 300-year-old curse, Alara sprinted. She leaped over the jagged remains of the altar, her boots skidding on the blood-red glass. Brooks swung a clawed hand at her, but Dominic's silver-etched bullets finally found their mark, shattering Brooks's violet armor and forcing him back for a crucial second. Alara reached the orb. It was beautiful and terrifying, a swirling nebula of every mistake humanity had ever made. As she held out the locket, the core lashed out. Images flashed before her eyes. Julian standing over her father's grave with a cold smile. Julian draining her life while she lay withered on a stone slab. Julian laughing as the world burned. The moon was lying, screaming its last desperate deceptions into her mind. He's a monster. He's using you. Break the bond. No, Alara whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. He's the man who chose to die so I could live. And I am the woman who chooses to make him whole. She slammed the bone map onto the surface of the glowing orb. A deafening silence swallowed the cavern. For a heartbeat, the entire world went white. Then a pulse of pure, golden energy rippled outward from the locket. It hit Brooks Wickham, dissolving his violet shadow and leaving him a crumpled, unconscious heap of a man on the floor. It hit the obsidian walls, turning the black glass into clear, shimmering quartz. But most importantly, it hit Julian. The golden light surged into him not as a parasite but as a cure. The lines of the old debt on his skin vanished. The weight of 300 years of guilt evaporated. He stood tall, his eyes no longer glowing with a cursed amber, but shining with a clear human warmth. The orb shattered into 1,000 harmless sparks that drifted upward like fireflies, passing through the ceiling and returning to the sky. Above, the blood moon didn't just fade. It turned a brilliant, pearlescent silver. The eclipse was over. The curse was broken. Is everyone okay? Elena's voice broke the silence, her hand resting on Dominic's wounded shoulder. We're more than okay, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. He walked toward Alara, who was standing in the center of the quartz cathedral, the locket now a simple, beautiful piece of jewelry. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into a kiss that tasted of victory, redemption, and the first day of a brand new life. The tension that had defined their every moment was gone, replaced by a profound, earned peace. If you aren't crying right now, check your pulse. They did it. But what happens now that the moon is silver and the debt is paid? Stay tuned for the final part of our journey. The first rays of a true dawn began to filter through the cracks in the cavern ceiling, no longer crimson or violet, but a soft, hopeful gold. The air, once heavy with the scent of ancient blood and ozone, now smelled of damp earth and the sweet, awakening forest above. The quartz walls of the cathedral shimmered like diamonds, reflecting the new light of a world that was no longer under a celestial thumb. Julian pulled back from the kiss, his hands still framing Alara's face as if he were memorizing the reality of her. His eyes were a clear, vibrant amber now, no longer the predatory glow of a cursed man, but the warm, deep color of a sunset. For the first time in 3 centuries, the lines of tension around his mouth had smoothed away. He looked younger, lighter, as if a mountain had been lifted from his shoulders. It's over, Alara whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of exhaustion and a joy so profound it felt like a physical weight. She looked down at the locket. The bone map was gone, the surface now smooth, polished ivory that felt warm against her skin. The names, the ledger of the sacrificed, had vanished, released into the light. It's just beginning, Julian corrected her, his voice a low, melodic hum. Behind them, Dominic helped Elena to her feet. The two shared a quiet, knowing look. The kind of look between people who had stared into the abyss and survived. Brooks Wickham was gone, taken into custody by a specialized unit that Elena had summoned. A group that dealt with the unexplainable, so the rest of the world could sleep soundly. He would spend the rest of his life in a place where the moon's light couldn't reach him, a fitting end for a man who tried to auction off the stars. As they emerged from the subterranean halls into the Blackwood forest, the change was staggering. The trees weren't twisted shadows anymore. They were vibrant pines, their needles glistening with morning dew. The birds had returned, their songs a chaotic, beautiful symphony of life. What will you do now? Alara asked, leaning her head against Julian's shoulder as they walked toward the edge of the grove. You have 300 years of catching up to do. Julian stopped and turned to her, the morning sun catching the sharp lines of his jaw. I spent 3 centuries acquiring things, Alara. Artifacts, power, time. I thought that was how I'd survive. But you showed me that survival isn't the point. It's connection. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee, he didn't need to. The bond between them was already forged in fire. I want to spend the next century, the one that actually belongs to me, building something that isn't a museum for the dead. I want to build a life with you. He opened the box to reveal a ring carved from the same clear quartz that now lined the cavern, a piece of the sanctuary they had created together. Alara Huntley, he said, using her true name, the one she had reclaimed from the shadows of her lineage. Will you stay with me? Not as an anchor, not as a key, but as my partner. Alara didn't hesitate. She slid the ring onto her finger, the stone feeling like a promise kept. Try and stop me, Julian Corleone. The story of the blood moon would become a legend, a whisper among those who knew where to look. But for Alara and Julian, it was the foundation of a legacy that wouldn't be written in blood, but in the quiet moments of a Tuesday morning, in the shared laughter over coffee, and in the freedom of a love that was finally, truly their own. They walked out of the forest hand in hand, leaving the shadows behind. The sun was high now, the sky a brilliant, endless blue. The trial was over, the debt was paid, and for the first time in history the moon was just a light in the sky, and the heart was the only thing that held the power. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this epic journey. This story is a reminder that no matter how dark the night gets or how heavy the past feels, we always have the power to choose our own path. If you loved Alara and Julian's victory, please leave a comment with a crescent moon emoji and tell me what your favorite part of the story was. And if you haven't yet, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We have so many more incredible stories to tell you. Until next time, stay in the light.